All right, so here we are. So what we're going to do is we're going to play with some settings first. For example, I'm going to start with just a little information about the metallic threads. We're used to playing with these metallics, but we aren't used to really digitizing specifically for them, or we end up adding metallic to a design that, we previously purchased. But the metallics are really neat, especially for the holiday season, but even just, normal things like adding just a little sparkle to them, they're even better than using something like Mylar. And while Mylar is fun and can be real quick, it also degrades much faster than a metallic thread. So if you're using a metallic thread, they come in different weights or sizes. There's 35 and 40 weights. And I was talking about, some of the differences between the Robinson Anton thread and the Madeira thread. And the Madeira I would put in the 40 weight calorie or category, but it's still, somewhat fragile. The 35 weight, it should really be looked at like the Robinson Anton thread. It's a little bit heavier, even though they say that it's a 40. And when you're doing this, you should make your fills about 10 to 15% less than you would, your normal density. So, if you have a stitch density of 4, then you might want to try maybe a stitch density of 5 with the metallic. So what we're going to work on here is just a couple of different things. So if we're going to do a metallic file, I want you to come over and, we're just going to grab like, just our regular little rectangle tool. And, you can see here it says area, auto judge. Well, let's go ahead and click on this, and we're going to come down here and make this a complex fill. And you can change the color if you want. I'm going to go ahead and just change this to green. And what I want to do is I'm going to make just, a very simple square. And then I'm going to come over here and I'm going to hold my control key and I'm going to make a longer, thinner square. And if you have your grids on, go ahead and just make this, about half of that. Okay, so what we have is, really 2 areas. They're complex fills, and we're going to hit escape. This first one we're going to change. So let's come down here and we'll just make it a satin fill. And this we're going to leave at a complex. But I'm going to go ahead and right-click and select that complex fill. And if I'm going to make this a metallic file, then I need to start looking at a couple of things. My underlay, what I'm doing with my underlay, what I'm going to do with, like the stitch length, how I want to handle that. So this is for just making an entire filled area in metallic. Now, as you already know, you're going to slow your machine down. You're going to drop your tension, and I would recommend, because the machines handle these threads so much differently, I would recommend that you test stitch what that tension should be. You want, as little tension as needed on the thread so it doesn't break, but not so much that it's looping, because metallic's going to loft anyway. Now, the other thing is whether to put this on a horizontal or vertical spool. And I find using the machine spool that's horizontal, laying flat, better than having it try to spin that cone on a vertical spool pin, mainly because that just adds more tension to that thread. And the thread is really a polyester core with the metallic foil wrapped around it. So it tends to shred and, and of course it tends to break easier. You're also going to make sure that you have the right needle. And, while I usually like having the smallest needle possible when doing embroidery, you're going to want to really look at a metallic needle for this, because A, it protects the thread, and you're going to want to look at this in a 12 to 14 size needle. So I'm going to go into my settings, and in my settings, here's my complex fill. My basic step here is 3. And, there's my tie stitch, which I still do want. I do want to use underlay, and of course I'm going to want to use compensation. But let's take a look at our underlay. So if I go over here to the underlay, I have a complex edge and a tatami underlay. Well, the complex edge is going to define that. And, if we are, lowering our tension on top, that doesn't necessarily mean, it doesn't mean that, I'm not going to have as much, maybe sometimes a little more pull. Metallic's a very stiff thread on some level. So if I'm looking at this, the way to get the best fill for me is going to be to take a look at what I've got here. And at this complex edge right here, I'm going to take a look at what my stitch settings are. That margin is fine. My maximum step is set to 4, mainly because I have this cotton or woven option set. And, I might want to go ahead and make that 5. And my minimum step is 0.4. Now, here's going to be the problem with this. If I make this like 0.6 or 0.7 and I have a complicated area, I'm going to have to watch that it navigates, the underlay navigates without sticking out. But I'm going to go ahead and change this stitch length so that I don't have a lot of problems. And I'm going to go ahead and change it to, 0.7. Now, the same thing up here, like my tatami underlay, I'm going to go ahead and change that to 5. My density is at 3. I could even change that to 3.5. But here, my minimum step is 0.2, and that has to do with getting these points correct. So what I might do here is say, let's go ahead and make that 0.7, and we'll see what happens. Now, when I come over to the complex mode here, my thread is going to be more dense, but, common sense tells you that, metallic threads kind of loft, so there might not be as much coverage, right? So I could try leaving this at this density, especially if I'm using Madeira thread. I could leave it at this density. Using smooth edges, we're going to leave alone for right now, and I'm just going to go ahead and leave my pattern at the default. So I'm going to go ahead and apply this. And then we're going to take a look at this in a different way. Let me kind of zoom in on that. And, here's my in and here's my out. And you can see I have that travel stitch. Now remember, and I have a couple of travel stitches. Remember, metallic thread lofts, and that means that underlay is going to loft a little bit too. So, I'm going to try to maybe mitigate that by, moving my endpoint, and let's go ahead and generate and see what happens. You can see I just have the overlap stitches. Now I'll go ahead and now undo that so you can see what I'm talking about. Okay, so when it was here, see this line here? And if I go into the stitch player, let's go ahead and start this playing. There's that line that's dead center in the middle, and then that's sitting on top of it. Now that may smash it down somewhat, but it might not. And you can see this is a pretty simple area, right? You can also see that my edge underlay is stitching last, which I'm going to want to change that setting. So let's go out of this. Let's get back to our view. All right, so you saw that we had that line that went up, and maybe that would work and maybe that wouldn't work. We have another problem too. So I'm going to right click on this, and we'll go ahead and we'll move this in and out point first. And I'm going to go back into the settings. And what I want to do is go into that underlay. And the complex edge was supposed to stitch first. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit that up and apply it and say, okay, and let's see if we can get that to work properly. That's just going to be a program issue. So now, I've changed that in and out point. Let's see if we were able to get rid of that line. And we'll go ahead and start playing. And there we go. We've got that to work right. But now we've got this other little odd line. So, you're going to have to kind of play with that and decide, this one will be smashed down. It's this line that's an issue. So, when looking at this, we really have to kind of think, what can we do about it? And in generations, unfortunately, sometimes it just does this and there's not a lot you can do about it. You can play with those and see if it works, move your in and out points. Like, maybe I'll move my out point to here and my in point to over here and generate. Now, you can see I still have those same problems. So, in this case, it's just going to be what it is. I can try one more move and see if that helps. And, that seems to have taken out some things, but you can see there's still this here. So when dealing with that, you just have to kind of look at that and decide, is that going to loft? Is it going to be a problem? And how much do you want to invest in moving those in and out points? So we're going to leave this at the 40. And we're going to go ahead and see how that stitches in our test stitch. Remember, we left our maximum or our basic step or stitch length at 3. We left our density here and our maximum step is at 4. Well, remember that this maximum step and this basic step, this is what's going to control it. So if you want a little bit longer stitch length, go ahead and try 4. And, if you watch my stitch count, it should decrease. Right now I'm at 7,285. And if I hit apply, I jump down to 5,734. Big, huge difference changing that stitch length. And in the case of metallic thread, that might be a good thing. So here's our first little metallic sample. And I'm going to go ahead and just, copy and paste. And I'll change the color of this just so that it's, a little bit different. We know. Okay, so now this is at a 45-degree angle. If I change this, that could help too. So we'll go ahead and change that a little bit and see how it does. But my stitch count didn't increase. Now this one is at 45 degrees too, which we very rarely stitch at. So I'm going to go ahead and, I'll change that as well. Maybe try that stitch length. We already know the in and out points are an issue. This has the same settings as this right now. So what we're going to do is go in here. And there's our basic step. We left it at 4. We could try 3 if we want to. But let's go in and look at our underlay. Okay, we have the tatami and the complex fill. Let's move that up. And we can leave these as is right now. But let's take a look at this. There's our max step. There's our density. Let's try a density of 4. And let's go over to our complex fill. And I'm going to take the density here up to 0.5 instead of 0.4. And I'll go ahead and say OK. And we're going to drop these stitches down even further. You can see I have 4568. Okay, now changing that density isn't too drastic, but it should give me, a little better control if I have a thicker, heavier thread. And I just want to check one thing real quick on this. I'm going to check my underlay to make sure that's there and that's there. And let's go over to the complex fill section. Here's my minimum step again. I can change this, but if I do, watch what happens up in here. If I change that to 0.4, that looks like it's going to be okay, because that's really going to be the determining factor in if you change that setting. And I would keep trying to bump it up to as high as you can get without a drastic change in those corners, right? So there we are. I got it up to 0.6, and that should be good. That's going to give me fewer thread breaks. And you can see I still have some funny things going on here. And, if you really want to play with this, you can. You're going to have to kind of determine what works for you in the scope of those threads underneath. All right, so let's go ahead and try putting them both together. That doesn't really help either. And it really is just kind of a quirk in the program. All right, so no matter what I do, I'm going to have those issues. And the ones that are going to give me the biggest issues might be these, but with that underlay going over top of them, I might just be okay with it. All right, so, there are a couple of our settings for metallic thread, and this is just in stitching with metallic thread. Now, I'm not going to want to stitch a big giant area with metallic thread. That's going to be an exercise in frustration, no matter how good my machine is, no matter how perfect the digitizing is, because, metallic thread's going to snap more often. Even good metallic thread, every time that goes through the fabric in the needle, even with that scarf, it's going to wear that foil a little bit. So, all right, let me go back in here now. This is, I'm going to kind of stick with just dealing with stitching in metallic thread for right now. Okay, so if we are going to use like a satin stitch, and I'll go ahead and change this color too. Let me go ahead and go into 3D for a second. Okay, so here's our complex fills for right now. And these are real basic things. And, if I want to do metallic thread in a satin stitch, the wider the satin, the more, loft really I'm going to get, but the more it's going to show the fabric underneath. Metallic thread in a satin stitch is really, really stunning, but it isn't always the best at filling. And, you hit a point, and it depends on how wide your satin is too. You hit a point where any wide satin, really needs to be beefed up in the density. And, your metallic thread isn't going to change that principle in digitizing. So we're going to start with this wider metallic piece here, or this wider satin. I'm going to go ahead and right now I'm going to copy and paste this, and we'll just move it over here for right now. And we'll change that color as well. But right now we're going to deal with this one. And this one is, if I go into, my property settings, we know it's less than 10 millimeters wide. And we also know that we don't want to make anything wider than 8, preferably, millimeters wide on a satin, because it begins to get gappy. Now, metallic is a little more rigid, so it's not as gappy in the same way as like polyester or rayon would be. It's gappy in a different way. It's gappy in that it shows stuff underneath here. So while you're, using metallic for satin areas that are wider, you're going to want to handle this a little bit differently. And we're going to start with our underlay. So if I go into my underlay, I still have that edge, and then I have a zigzag. Well, let's get rid of the zigzag for right now. And we have our edge, and we're going to go ahead and change that, our minimum step. And I'm going to go ahead and try to push that as far as I can. And because this is straight up and down, I can. My maximum step is 4. Okay, I could change that if I want to, but I think I'll leave it at 4 for this for satin. Then I want to pick my grid, and I'm going to move it over into this area. So here's my grid. My maximum step is 8. That's a little bit long. I'm going to go ahead and change it to 4. My minimum step, I'll bump up to 0.7 if I can, and we'll see what happens. There's my slant, there's my margin, and there's my density. And we're going to look at this slant in a minute. The density's at 4, and I'm going to leave it there. As a matter of fact, I could go down to 3. And let's go ahead and say okay on this one, and I'm going to generate, and then we're going to go in and take a look at this. And let me go to 3D. Okay, so this, these, we'll do it this way. We'll just cheat, move it up into the first sewing direction. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom in on just this and go into our player. And here's what's going on. I've got my edge. Okay, and there is that slant. See what the slant is, 0.5? Well, I really want this to cover better. So that slant is not really going to work for me, and we're going to play with that a little bit. I want to try to get it to be an X or a grid type look. So let's go out of our stitch player and go back into our settings. So If my slant is 0.5, let's try a slant of 0.7, and I'll show you what that does. So there's the edge. There's my first one. And you can see there's not too much different here, right? Looks kind of the same. So let's go back and let's try this. 0.7 didn't really make much of a difference on that slant. So you know what? Let's try 1.0 and generate. And with the satin area, I'm going to go ahead and move that in and out point like that. And usually if you put them in the opposite direction over here, you're good. So I've moved the in at this place and the out at here, and let's go ahead and take a look at our stitch player with that new setting. So here we go. And you can see it's making a little bit of a difference here. We're starting to get more of an X look. And so, you know, we're getting in the right direction. So I'm going to go into here and we'll just go ahead and try 3.0. And let's go ahead and generate. And when I put that slant at 3.0, you know, there's my slant. See the difference? Huge difference in how that covers and how that covers the fabric underneath. So, you know, play with those settings until you get what you want. But my goal is to create a base cover underneath so that I don't have to bump the density up too high. But you can see how that looks. That looks pretty good. Those stitches are fairly long. Let me go out of this and we're going to zoom in real close here. And let's go to our needle penetrations. You can see that, you know, they're not, this isn't like a satin stitch that's going to pull. This is more like a zigzag type of thing. So it's not going to be super duper, you know, long stitches that pull more. It'll pull a little bit just for the simple fact that, you know, it is in fact a satiny type of stitch. But let me go back here. Now, again, we have the same problem with this is just a bug, and I'm not sure why it's like this. Whoops, I want to keep that. But I'm going to go in here, and I'm just going to click on that edge and tell it up. And then I'm going to say OK. Well, before I say OK, I'm going to go over here to my satin stitch. Now, if I'm putting a fill in here, all bets are off. You know, I'm going to have to look at that because it's going to be more along the lines of a complex type of thing. But I'm not putting a fill in here. You know, I'm going to go ahead and leave it as, you know, a satin stitch. So what I want to look at here is my density. And of course, you know, my max and min steps. You know, in this case, it doesn't make much difference on this min step because it's just a very simple thing. But my density here, you know, if the standard is 0.4, I'm going to start with that and I'm going to do a test stitch. But if this is a long enough or wide enough satin across here, I might want to take a look at going 0.35 and test that out. So since this is wider, I'm going to go ahead and say 0.35, and we're going to go ahead and make this a little bit wider. Right about there, and let's take a look and make sure we didn't. Okay, so that's going to be my wider satin, right? And I'm going to play with this. I'm going to have to play with this density, and I'm going to have to play with that setting underneath and make sure that, you know, I get coverage because there is going to be a little bit gapping. Now, there's something else we can do with this. We're going to cover in lessons down the road. But remember, this is going to have loft, and my goal is to fill it so it looks nice, but not make it so dense I can't stand it. So on this one, I'm going to go ahead and just copy and paste this, by the way, and move this one over, and we're going to leave the settings on this one, but this one we'll change to a different color. Let's change it to pink, and I'm going to go into the settings and I'm going to create a little test for myself, and we're going to take this to 0.4. and say okay. And, do a test because it depends on your thread and what's going on with your thread and how that's going to behave. So I'm going to make one, copy and paste, and we'll change the color of this. And let's make it a different color completely. And so this is going to be for, this is going to be 0.35, a little bit tighter density, smaller number, the closer those, stitching lines are together. And then this one, we're going to go ahead and change to 0.45. So let me generate. Okay, and the reason I did this is if you have Madeira threads, you might get away with it here, but you might want to take a look at this with the Madeira thread. If you have Robinson Anton, this might work. This would probably be too tight, and this might be the best bet. So, if my density here is 0.45, this is 0.4, and this is 0.35. Okay, so does that make sense on, this is for wide satin stitching. We're going to go back here. So I'm going to leave these here. Now this, we're going to take a look at making it small. And this is going to apply to complex areas too. So I'm going to make this very narrow. And if you look at the size, if I look down here, it's saying that it's like less than a millimeter. Okay, now here's the problem. Lettering in metallic is often less than a millimeter. And as you know from previous webinars, let me go ahead and generate that anything less than a millimeter is going to cause problems, and that's going to be more so with metallic thread. So there are a couple of different things that we would do with regards to metallic thread and this, and I am going to change my in and out points, and that's going to include my underlay. So let's go ahead and generate. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to take a look at a couple of things. First off, here's my underlay. I don't really need this at all, so we're going to remove it. I do need the edge or the center. And with 1 millimeter, to be honest, I'm going to remove that edge and use the center. But, the same thing, I'm going to have, the same type of issues in here. 8's going to be too long, so I might go ahead and say maybe 5. And, this, I'm going to make this 0.6 or 7. And I have the opposite problem here. Because it's so narrow, I might want to take a look at this and start with 0.45. You change that to a lighter color too. All right, so now the other problem I'm going to have with this is if it's less than 1 millimeter wide, it doesn't matter how much compensation I put on it. The fact of the matter is it's just more narrow than, you need it to be, right? I might bump that up to 0.5 as well on the density, but you're going to have to do a test stitch and see what you think. But the one thing I'm going to have to look at is stitch angles. On the stitch angles here, less than 1 millimeter has to be handled in a certain way. So we're going to go up to our view angle. And in the view angle, let me zoom in here. Here's my guidelines, and you can see it's just going very straight. Well, I'm going to make this real easy. I'm just going to right click and go into add a stitch direction guideline. And what I want to do is go ahead and just, angle it almost at 45 degrees. But then I run into a problem up here and down here. So what I'm going to do is just move those over. And they don't have to actually touch, but I'm going to move them over a little bit and go ahead and generate. Now remember, we set our stitch lengths at a longer stitch length, right? So when I get down to here, I start getting a little bit, let me go out of 3D, I get a little bit of a curve because I set the stitch lengths. And how much of a curve is going to be noticeable? Well, that depends on the area. I'm going to want to watch this. I might want to go ahead and take my chances here and go back into my satin. And, well, I guess the minimum step is still 0.2. I didn't change it on that, sorry. And, I don't want to go below 0.1 here. I don't really even like 0.2, but we're going to go ahead and say okay, and I'm just going to have to decide how important is that? Is it going to show? Maybe there's a way to hide it. I'm going to have to be careful. My density is 0.45, but I may actually want to go up to 0.5. And this is just, you can see the stitch length. Let me go out of 3D. See the angle? And what I'm gunning for here is I want to make sure that this is, long enough to stitch properly. So I'm going to get my ruler, which is right up here, and I'm going to press and hold my left mouse button. I'm going to drag across one of these stitches. And you can see that I've gotten that stitch length to be almost 3 millimeters. And that's going to make a huge difference. Right click to turn off that tool, but that's going to make a huge difference. If I take a look at that, then, really do a couple of test stitches. And it's the same thing here. I'm just going to do a couple of test stitches. Now, these are just, your standard files. These are just straight lines. These are, just going to be little test stitches. And what we're going to make sure here is you're going to take a look at this when you test stitch it, and you're going to take a look at your back and see how this looks on the back. See how much tension, there is. Metallic thread, it's a funny thread. It pulls a little bit differently. So you're going to want to look and see if there's any looping. Did you drop your machine tension down too much? Did you, do you need to drop it more? You're going to take a look at all of those things. But, mostly you're going to want to see if your thread is breaking. If your thread is breaking, you really have to look at that tension and look at your needle and, even really look at your backing. Like for metallic thread, using sticky backing is not the best. Cut away and tear away, it should be fine. You're going to use a metallic needle, which is a sharper needle. So metallics on knits might not be your best bet either. So, I hope that is all making sense on that. Now, I want to take a look at, dealing with some other fill types, because metallic can be a lot of fun. And, it also can be used in different things if you set things properly. Okay, now, let me go ahead and make a new file. I'm going to make some shapes that I think metallic looks really nice in, for example, like fireworks or, snowflakes. And when I get to the snowflakes, we'll take a look at the building blocks, because they're just like the perfect things to look at on how to deal with small satin and metallic. But let's go ahead and we're going to start with one of these shapes. It's called the punch ring over here on, this toolbar. And so I'm going to pick my punch ring. And, it says auto judge. We're just going to take it to, let's just go with radial from the word go, right? And left click and drag. And I'm going to go ahead and just make this a circle. I'll make this a little bit smaller and press enter. And then I'm going to press escape. Okay, so this is what we have. You can see, there's my center. This is the radial. And, in radial, that gets thicker in here and thinner out here. Well, that becomes a bigger issue with metallic thread than, with your rayon or polyester. So I'm going to go ahead and take a look at our settings. Now, with radial, when I go to underlay, I have a complex grid, or I have my tatami. Honestly, the complex grid is going to give you a little more stability, but also could give you a little bit more pull. But this is still a good option here. Complex edge, let's move that up. And, here's my edge 4 and, 0.4. And again, I'm going to try to get away with a larger step here. My margin is fine. My maximum step should be good. On my grid, maximum step at 6. I might want to try 5 or even 4 here. Minimum step, 0.7. Let's try that. Density is 4. Well, I could, leave that at 4. Or I could bump that up to 5. This is going to have some coverage. But let's go ahead and apply that. And what I'm looking for is if anything's sticking out here. And it looks like it's going to be okay. There's nothing showing, sticking out on the edge here. So let's take a look at our radial fill. Now, depending on what I'm looking for, right now that's a very long satin stitch, right? Well, I'm going to go ahead and use a pattern on this long satin stitch. But I'm not going to use a pattern like this. I'm going to go and select the pattern. And I'm going to look for something maybe along the lines of this or this. And then I'm going to take a look at these things. Maximum step 6, minimum step 2, density 3.8. And I'm going to start out with 0.4. Now, maximum step of 6. All right, this comes into play only when the basic tab is used. So, or with the basic tab, I should say. But, let's look at our auto stitch shortening. Okay, right now it's on automatic and the automatic does pretty good. Our density is not too unreasonable, but if I want to come in here, I can take a look at what these things do. And, in the manual, because I always forget how to do with this, there's a really good explanation for how these things work. Shorten percentage, 95. Well, let's go ahead and try 90. See what's happening here? 95, 90, and this is probably giving you a better preview of what's going to happen. It's going to pull those stitches up in there. So let's go ahead and say apply, and if we look, we have 9,152, and I'm going to go ahead and say okay, and generate, and then I'm going to undo that so we can go back and look at our stitch count. All right, so, and I'm also going to zoom in right in here. Okay, see what's going on? If I go back into my settings, and just double check, I probably took everything out here. See, it's gone back to the default, so we'll go ahead and just change those real quick. And I'm going to take this down to 5 and this density up to 5. Then I'm going to click on that, move it up. And you're just going to have to check on that. But if I apply it, you can see what happens right away. Okay, see this edge here is now what we're going to start looking at. Let's go over to radial. I said I was going to use a pattern. And then we selected this pattern. So I'm going to go ahead and apply that. And you don't really see it because I don't have it in 3D preview, but the pattern is there. This is what we're going to look at now. So let's go to our set percentage. We're at 95. So I'm going to make this a little more drastic and put 80. We'll leave this as is. And we'll apply it. See that pullback right there? I still have the stitches on top, but I've pulled a little further back. And, that might be beneficial with metallic threads, especially if I'm starting to get jammed up with a small hole. All right, so let's go back here. And what if I say, let's make this 25%? See what's going on here? See how that comes all the way back in? You can see just that little bit of, pull back there. Well, that is probably going to cause me some problems. Okay, that's pretty tight in there. So the original was 55. Okay, so that's where we pulled back, and you can see 55% increases that. So let's go back over to set percentage, and we'll take this to 95, and let's take this to 65. And what that's going to do is you can see the filtering a little more. It's brought these down, right? It's brought these lengths down, but it's filtered more in here. So I hope that's making sense. Let me make this 90. Okay. And so 90% of the stitches are filtered out. I'm hoping this is making sense. This is the shortened percentage. So if I say 50, see how that looks? 50-50. Apply it. That means that it's going to pull back 50%. And I'm going to put this back up to 95. Even 90 would be acceptable. The shortened percentage is different. If I say to shorten this 100%, then it's going to pull back every single stitch pretty much from here, or close to it. And let's go 90 and apply it. And if I go all the way to the other extreme and say 10, see what's going on here? 50. 25. Okay, it's talking about the percentage of stitches here that pull back. And, really, realistically, 55 is pretty reasonable. If I'm running into trouble, I might want to take it up to 75. Because the top stitches are still going to go, but 75% of those underlying stitches are going to pull back. So I hope that makes more sense. Like, this looks like it's heavy on top, but underneath has been pulled back 75% of the stitches. So I hope that makes sense. But here's what we have. See how short that pattern is right now? And I'm going to zoom in. See how short really those stitches are in the pattern? Well, this is where my stitch length comes into play a lot more than what I would think. So it's still selected, so I'm going to go into my settings here. Remember I said my basic step here controlled, and the maximum step really doesn't, right? Whatever is on this tab as a basic step is my default stitching. That maximum step is only the stitch length that's allowed to finish the pattern in the event of an odd area. So I'm going to change this basic step to 6.0 and apply it. See the difference? So those stitches are now 6 millimeters long. If I change this to 2, that's going to be way too short, but see the difference here? So in this case, 6.0 applied to this might not be a bad setting. It's going to be long. I might want to take it down to 5, but it might not be a bad setting. And see these little settings up here, these little stitches up here? That is where this minimum step is going to come into play, down here and up here. So if I make that minimum step 0.7, so that I avoid short stitches. Do you see the difference in how that looks? It didn't change the appearance of the shape significantly. What it did was resolve the problems in these short stitches. So I'm going to go ahead and say OK. And right now our density is at 0.38. Well, we've controlled the density in here. And, if we want to control the density throughout, we've got that grid on there. I might go ahead and say 0.4 or 0.45 because I'm stitching with a metallic thread. And, this area is not large. I might want to shrink it down just a tad. But, you know, this can be a pretty dramatic effect if I can control the density inside here and not allow that to become a thread breaking issue because it's heavier in that middle, and still get, the results that I really want. So, remember, we do have our grid underneath here, which is going to cover a little bit. And, because it's an odd shape, I'm going to, there's no way to avoid some of these little extra lines. But there's my grid. And if you feel that that's too heavy, because really it's going to come down to test stitching based on your fabric and test stitching based on your thread, you can always come back in here, go into that underlay. And I just have gotten in the habit of hitting that every single time, but come in here and change that density to 6. And if you get that message, it means you have to change your maximum step too. So let's try 5.5 and 5.5. And see how that goes. Now with this, there's all kinds of fun things I can do. Like, for example, maybe I really want to make a fireworks type of effect. So if that's the case, then, let's just go ahead and copy and paste this. And I'm going to change the color on this. And we'll play with this one a little bit more too. But, here's this. Let's go ahead and copy and paste it one more time. And I'm going to change the color on this. And there we go. All right. So if I want to play with this one a little bit more, let's go into our settings. And you know that radial is really neat when using your feather stitch. So I'm going to go ahead and say edit, and I'll come into my feather stitch. I'm going to have to be careful, like, side A or side B. I'm not sure why it's not highlighting, but I'm going to say side A, and just to see which side it's on, I'm going to apply it. Okay, that's the side I want. Now, I just picked like my standard feather, left the positive and the negative as is. So, and and I'm not going to worry about enabling a pattern right now because, these are things that you can play with. But let's go ahead and say okay. And I'm going to say okay here just so we can zoom in. You can see I've got stuff hanging out underneath here. And, it's going to be the same, if I do the inside as well, I'm going to have a problem, with things showing, right? So let's go back into my properties. And what's showing is my underlay. Well, I don't want to turn it off. I want to have some loft. I want to have some coverage. So, my choices are to either edit my feather stitch so that I have no negative. But sometimes I don't get the same results. Let me put that back to 4. Or sometimes I just can't use a pattern that I made or one of the patterns that are pre-made in that feather stitch that have negative settings, right? And, it kind of affects the whole look of things. It also affects blending. So I need to look at my underlay. If I want to control this, well, the problem is that 4 millimeters in is how deep that inside feather can go. And to change that, I would look at this complex edge, and my margin has to go to like 4.25 or 4.5. And of course, I would have to bump that back up again, but for right now, we'll just say apply. All right, so this one, it has to be the same thing. My margin has to be like 4.25, bare minimum. And, what I'm seeing underneath here isn't really my underlay anymore, I don't believe, but let's make this 4.5. And we'll make this 4.5 too, just to make sure. Let's move that up and apply it. Okay, now what I'm seeing, I think here is not my underlay, but we're going to go check it out. Let me go out of 3D. And we'll go into our player. And let's skip ahead a couple colors here. And I should be able to just skip colors, but for some reason I'm not just skipping colors, so hold on. All right, let's kind of cheat a little bit on this. We'll move that up to the top of the stitching order. And then let's go here. All right, so let's go back into our player for a second and take a look at this. So, if I go ahead and start playing this, what is going on? There's my underlay. And we're going to start watching where those stitches go and what's actually sticking out there. You can see a little bit of its underlay. So I'm going to have to really take a look at, how do I handle this grid? That would show, for some reason my grid didn't seem to adjust on the settings. So let's go out of this and go back in here and take a look. I thought maybe I changed the wrong setting, but let me take a look. There's my complex grid, density, margin. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get a little more drastic. And if that continues to be an issue, if this is going to continue to show your grid, then, you need to just come in here and remove it, because obviously it's not going to let me, get, any shorter here. It's not going to let me deal with this in a way that I want. So in that case, I would remove your complex grid, and you can try this, depends on, what your settings are going to be. Maximum step 8, of course I don't want that. I would go with maybe 4, and my margin, let's try 5.0. And you can see that's going to play a little bit nicer than my grid does. Maximum step and density have to be pretty much the same. The minimum step, I might take that one down to 0.7 just to give me a little bit better. So, when you're playing with that radial and the feathering, you might have to take a look at the grid. The grid has some rigidity to it. And even in here, I've got a little bit of things hanging out. And, if you really run into a problem and this is really what you want, you can do this with the grid as well. But go out of 3D, go into your stitch needle points, use your, this is your needle points, use your edit mode, and just come in here and grab these points. Make sure you're getting what you want and move them. The problem is when you do this, it's going to lock this area because you've done really a stitch point edit. But you can do that. If these are really getting under your skin, you can even delete them. Like this one might be a little bit harder to get, but if I press delete, 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 come up here and hit delete, delete, I can get rid of them that way too. But the problem is it really does lock it. So you're not going to want to do that final edit, until you are done with everything. So I'm going to go out of that and I'm going to make sure I turn off my edit mode. And, we're going to take a look at this in a little different light. Now, if you're looking at it like this and you're seeing, like this would definitely show, this is probably not going to show. It looks worse when you're out of your 3D preview, but something like right in here would show, and you would want to do your stitch edit, or you would want to actually just make a manual underlay, which you can also do. So I'll show you that real quick too, and then we're going to kind of go on to this and then we'll be done for today. But if you are running into a problem and the editing is, I'm going to have to unlock this and regenerate. But if the editing is getting under your nerve and you see no reason for it, what you can do is this. Go in here and you can simply go to your underlay, get rid of this. Your complex edge does not seem to be the problem in this. It's, those grid or, tatami underlays that are trying to navigate those corners. So what you can do is you can make your own underlay. And to make your own underlay, Remember, this is going to poof, but you might want to use your freehand line. And, put it up on top first. Start up here. Make sure it's not double run, and we can change that afterwards. We could change it here if we want to, or we can just make it a run. But, we're going to change some settings anyway. So, if I want to make my own underlay, I can do that. I can just come down here and just watch where your edges are. And I don't have to worry about making a million points. And actually that start at the top, I probably would adjust that. But you can see what I can do. I can control where this is going to be. And I can make it anything I want. If I want to make it a grid, I certainly can. If I want to make it go opposite of what's going on here, I can control that a little bit too. You can see just from the edge, I've got a little bit of play here on how that's traveling. So those things are there too. And I can kind of line that up with this. But the whole point of underlay is to attach this to the backing and provide stability. And if the stitches are going like this is actually a pretty good underlay to use, or at least that direction. The problem is I don't want to do too much of it. And I do want like some stability. So I could even come down here and do something like this, where I'm making really my own type of grid. And if you get the angles wrong, remember you can just backspace. But, I'm not going to go all the way around, but, then I can come back here, like from here to here, I can make almost my own zigzag. So you always have those options. It doesn't have to be perfect, but at least you can control where it goes. You can see I can control, if I made that point too much, it's actually a lot easier to edit too. I can just come in here and deal with this, and it doesn't lock on me. And then, of course, I would just move this to top and make sure it's the same color. And if you do a line like this manually, remember those in and out points are manually controlled. So you need to go in here and right click and say properties in your film strip. Right click on that cell where it's a line, go to properties and say no, and remove those checks next to user define in and user define out. If you use the satin stitch input or the line input, you are manually defining your in and out points. Okay, so you have a lot of different options on your underlay. And underlay actually is really important for metallic because it lofts and because it does pull a little bit more. But you don't want to overdo it in big areas like this. So now this area, we were going to look at how to make like a fireworks type of deal. And to do that, I can use this area, I can use running lines. But we're going to start with an area. So we'll go over here, and I am just going to turn off underlay. I am absolutely going to use my feather stitch, and I'm going to want this to be relatively dramatic. So we'll go with 10, and in the negative, maybe, let's go with 7. And say, okay, and when I apply this, there we go. It's like, boom, right? Now, I can also apply feathering on the inside. So let's go ahead and we'll get that part going. And here's my inside. There's positive and there's negative. The positive is going to go out and the negative is going to go in. So, I might want to go ahead and make this 7. And depending on how big this is, let's try 8. And say apply. You can see what's gone on. It's gone almost into that center now. Then I'm going to come over to my radial tab, and I am going to not worry about these max and minimum steps. Not right now. I'm going to worry about my density, and we're going to make this 5.0 and apply it. And you can see what happens here. I've got to worry about these underlay things. I've got to worry about my traveling. And, there's all these little interesting things that happen when I change that density. this is not nearly as dramatic as it was just a few minutes ago. So play with your density and hit that apply button and see what you like. And if it changes drastically, right? Because even at 1.0, it still looks kind of like a firework, right? I still have somewhat of the same, results. It's not quite as drastic inside here, but, 5.0, it doesn't look anything like what I want it to look like. Well, don't worry, you can come over to your basic tab, go back into your feathers, and, maybe your negative just needs to be 5. Maybe this needs to be a little more dramatic. Maybe the positive needs to be, a little more dramatic, and the negative, a little less dramatic. You can see the changes, but I'm going to go ahead and leave this as is for right now and say, okay. And here, this is a little bit easier to kind of navigate sometimes. You can see where things start and where they end. So let's go ahead and try this, generate. If that doesn't work, you know what? That's what this little thing up here is for on the undo button. Move that in and out point. Maybe try moving it here. And as I'm looking at this, I'm looking to see what's going on. Maybe my out point just needs to be down in here. And, sometimes this is probably the more frustrating thing to work with. In worst case, I'm going to try moving that to the inside. Okay, and here's one of the things about radial that does kind of drive me crazy is you don't really have as much control as you would like on these traveling stitches. But so what you're going to try to do on this one is just kind of come up with the best scenario you can. This one, could be better, could be worse, but I might try up here. And I'm getting a little bit closer to something that's looking better. So I might get brave and try moving it over here. And what I find generally on radial is the closer together these points can get, unless they're like that, the better off you are. Let me go back. And this is what I have now. You've got to think about this like a satin stitch. And, only difference is this is meeting in like a circle, but it's still really just a satin stitch. So here we go. We've got this, and we've got this, figured out pretty good, at least, what it's going to look like, right? So here's one piece of it. I'm going to move that over. I'm going to copy, and I'm going to paste it. And then come down here to that copy and change the color. You can see even just changing the color sometimes changes this, the look of this. But let's go ahead and left click on this and make one of these bigger. And let me undo that real quick. We're going to go ahead and hold our shift key and make this a little bit bigger. And let's generate. And you can see now all of a sudden I have, another problem. Well, this one's bigger now, so I can hide it underneath here. My in and out point are causing a little bit of stress, so I could try moving those. That's a little bit better. If I left click, I'm going to get this red one, but let's go ahead and left click a second time, and we're going to rotate this. And generate. And every time I make a change, I've got to be prepared that things just might not go the way I want them to with that that stitch underneath. And then it's just going to be a playing. And let me get this moved. And, if that becomes like such a frustration, one of the ways I always figured out what was really going on was I kind of looked at where it actually started and try to match those points. You can see I got a little bit better at this, where maybe the out point could go here. See? So if you pay attention to what's going on with those traveling stitches, you'll be able to control them a little bit better. So Janet, you have any questions? Oh, you get lost on those in and out points, Janet? Okay, which part do you get lost on? Oh, on the settings? The max for the feathering or the max stitch length setting? Let me put this into 3D. We still have our pattern. This pattern is actually still in here, by the way. So, it doesn't really show up as much, but it would still stitch a pattern. I forgot to mention that, but okay, so the stitch setting, the maximum stitch length. Okay, let me go through that just for a second. All right, so let's go back and we'll look at this one because this one has, no fluff to it, right? All right, so on this, let me go in here. You're talking about the basic step and then this maximum and minimum step, right? All right, so to make this a little more dramatic, the basic step is going to be the stitch length here. Okay, that's going to be the basic stitch length that's going to stitch. Like if I put this at 1.0, then it's going to stitch. See what happens here? It's going to be 1.0. It'd be way too small to stitch, but that is, you can see my stitch length is now 1.0, right? So that controls right here my actual stitch length. So I'm going to put that back to 6 for this pattern. You can see the difference, right? Now I might worry about too much pulling here. So, maybe I'll change that to 5. You can see it's going to change it again, right? So this basic step actually controls my stitch length for lines, for fills, for areas, for everything. If I come over to like my radial tab or, any tab here for the stitch type, then this maximum step means that if I have an odd area like right here maybe, and I have to create the shape, and it needs a different stitch length than the basic to do it, either a bigger one or a shorter one. That's where these come into play. I'm giving the program permission to make a short 0.7 millimeter stitch if that's what's required to fill the shape in and keep a pattern. I'm also giving it permission to create an odd long stitch if that's what's required to make the pattern, where a basic stitch just won't create the shape I want. So I'm giving it permission to ignore this in certain situations. So does that make more sense about what those settings are? Right, like you can fine tune with those max and min settings. And the most perfect example actually is, let me make a file real quick, would be like, I'm just going to make this kind of an odd, maybe that's not the best example, but it's kind of a good example. Let's spin this around. Oops. Okay, so I'm going to spin this around. Now, let me make this smaller. And let's generate. Let me check my stitch direction. Okay, I'm going to make that like that. All right, so let me get zoomed in here. The stitch length up at the top and the bottom here is going to be way shorter than the average stitch length in here, right? So if I go into these settings, there's my basic step of 4, you know, I will take it to 3. So there's my complex fill. There's my basic step of 3, right? Over here, I'm saying, well, hey, if you have to make a 4mm step to just fill something in, or a minimum step of 0.2 to fill in those points, then hey, go for it, right? So let's go ahead and apply that. And let me change my stitch direction, and we're going to make that 0. All right, so now see, if I didn't allow the short stitch lengths up here, I wouldn't get the sharper points. Over here I'd be fine, but I wouldn't get the points on here if I said, hey, the max you can create here is 4. The minimum step I'm going to give the program permission to do is 4mm. And what happens is I'm going to lose some things up here. Let me go ahead and say okay and generate. I would lose the crispness generally on these points. And this is it's kind of ignoring me because it's saying I can't make the shape if, you won't let me do this. But let's try this. We'll change this to 4 and see if that makes a difference. But, I would lose the crispness up here generally. So over here, let's go ahead and make this 0.1 and apply. And, if I needed to, I would have shorter stitches up here to make those points. I hope that makes sense. Like, it's hard to see it because I have the points being made here because of the shape. So, I hope that makes a little better sense. That's what the max and the min actually do.